I'm dressed down today because I'm cutting out. Didn't want to take the time. Sit up here in a robe on a day like this. You tend to get a little moist, so I have to go do a talk. I thought I better not. About 15 years ago or so, one of our budding church theologians made a comment that I wrote down, and I keep a file of these quotes, so if I ever need them, this one kind of poked up this last week. The quest for knowledge, he wrote, is pursued at higher speeds and with better tools today than ever before. But wisdom is no more common today than it was 3,000 years ago in the court of King Solomon. In fact, this generation is bloated with information and starved for wisdom. Well, you might say amen to that if you've been watching the television or reading anything in the newspapers of late. I am currently in my 36th year of ministry, and I was a second career person, which means that I have absorbed quite a large chunk of my life doing pastoring. And the truth is, I'm a lot smarter now, and I don't mean that as a boast, just that I have accumulated more information than I did the first day that I walked into the office at Covenant Lutheran Church back in St. Paris. I have access to more information at my fingertips, vastly better tools. I used to have a whole library full of books that I used to open now, and they don't need those anymore. I can go online and pretty much see anything that I want to see for language study or for theology or exegesis. In fact, I have more scholarly research available at my fingertips than I did at any time in my life, including my time in seminary. It's right there at my edge of my fingertips, and it's more than I could ever possibly read and absorb. Ever since that first day, I've made it my mission to stuff my brain with stuff, facts, information, strategies, every conceivable how-to you could name to try and improve my pastoral skills. I think it's true for much of our society. We are way smarter today than we were a generation ago, and by that I mean we have more information. The problem is, along came global warming and COVID and the rise of totalitarianism, and it all pretty much got made a hash of. Everything I thought I knew, well, not so much useful these days. Out of the experience that I had, doesn't seem to apply anymore. Right now, I feel as if society is standing at the edge of collapse. And I hope I'm wrong, but there's this kind of empty feeling in my gut as I watch things going on around me. Certainly, I agree that we're bloated with information and we're starving for wisdom. That's why this text from the Old Testament resonates with me every time I hear it, even more so today. But first, let me give you some context about this text. Just prior to this story, King David's eldest son, Absalom, has tried to overthrow his father's kingdom in a coup. That did not work out well. In a pitched battle, he is slain by David's general, Joab. And David, stricken by grief, is inconsolable because, well, like many of us, he had plans for his eldest son, and one of them was that his eldest son would ascend the throne upon his death. Well, at any rate, David has a second son, a preening, vainglorious twit named Adonijah, who has spent his entire life living in the palace, taking advantage of all the palace courtesans and being pretty much an entitled jerk. And being the next oldest, he assumes he's the next in line. That did not quite work out so well because God knows he's a hack. His father knows he's a hack. And so as David approaches his death, he is compelled to make arrangements for his youngest son, a boy named Solomon, to be his successor instead. And Solomon's not just the youngest. He's not a seasoned warrior. He's not a trained diplomat. In fact, he's barely old enough to be called an adult. Terribly insecure of his own ability to rule, he goes to the high place at his father's death. He goes there to Gibeon to consult and to worship and to make sacrifice to Yahweh, the God that had chosen his father David a half a century before to be the king over Israel. And there in a dream, Yahweh speaks to him. And I'll let the storyteller pick it up from here. Yahweh says, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon replies, "You've shown great and steadfast love for my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness. And now, Yahweh, my God, you have made your servant king in his place, though I am but a little child. I don't even know how to go out or to come in. And you have set me in the midst of a people that you have chosen, a people too numerous to count." The story comes from a larger group of stories that we scholars call the succession narratives. It explains how the youngest son, the least likely, the one that nobody would ever think could ascend to the throne, actually bypassed the two eldest, more capable sons to become king. And it's okay because remember that David was himself the seventh son of Jesse, the youngest. That when Nathan is sent by God to pick a new king to replace the hapless Saul, he goes to Bethlehem, to Jesse's house, because that's where God sent him, and he says, one of your sons is going to be king. And so, Jesse, like all good fathers, gets his sons and parades them around, best looking to worst looking, oldest to youngest. However, he did that, but they all stand there, and Nathan looks at one and goes, that guy looks like a king, every inch a king. Good looking, capable, handsome, everything. God says, nope, not that one. Okay, next. Went through the entire line until he gets to the sixth one, and he's out of sons. So he looks around and goes, got any more sons? Jesse goes, well, there's the youngest. He's out tending the sheep because that's what the youngest had to do, the crap jobs nobody else would do, which was tending the sheep. So they called David in, and boom, he's the one. Why? Because, as the story tells us, God sees with different eyes than we do. Well, that's the prophet. That's the story here. Solomon, like his father, finds himself chosen king after every other logical choice has been exhausted. There's no one left, and there he is. And we're plopped today in one I think is one of the most compelling and captivating stories of the Old Testament. And we're invited to stand in Solomon's shoes and to answer the question that God asked him, or maybe to ponder. What would it be like if God were to say, what would you like me to give you? And it'd be nice to imagine we would have done at least as well as Solomon did, that is, aced the test by answering it correctly. I doubt it, because really, having a lot of money sounds good to me. Yeah. And living a long and healthy life sounds good to me. And wanting my kids to be successful in my place sounds good to me. None of those things even seems to be an out-of-bounds thing to ask for. If we were nobler, we might think of asking for something like, I don't know, world peace, or cooling off global warming so it wouldn't be so darn hot and asthmatics wouldn't have to struggle going from their car to the front door of where they work, or for the rain to fall on the left coast so it wouldn't burn to the ground, or for it to be warm and sunny on the right coast so the hurricane wouldn't blow everything down. But Solomon doesn't ask for any of those things. Solomon asks for something, and I'm going to use the English translation of the Hebrew words. He asks for wisdom. And you may have heard about the wisdom of King Solomon. We normally think of wisdom as being smarter than, or better equipped than, or more informed than the average person around us. But that is not what it means in the Bible, not even close. In the Bible, it means something different. Solomon, who was too young to be king, probably 14 at the time of this incident, he only asks for one thing. He says, Yahweh, you have made your servant king in the place of my father David, though I am but a child. So give me wisdom to govern this great people of yours. Help me to know the difference between good and evil. But what is Solomon really asking for? Well, you know me. Let's a little word study here. Not Greek, but it's Hebrew. All right? Hebrew is a sparse and precise language. It only has 5,000 words or so. In contrast, Biblical Greek, which I am somewhat good at, has about 70,000 words. Modern English has about 750,000 words. That's why it's so hard to learn English, because whenever we see something new, we make up a word for it, and it kind of enters into the language. At any rate, when Solomon asks Yahweh for a gift, the ask is so big, he uses 2 of those 5,000 Hebrew words to describe it. He asks for a leb shema. Leb, a heart. Shema, that hears. A listening heart, a hearing heart. Translated as wisdom, but that's not what it says. Solomon believes the ability to listen is a thing that will help him to rule this people and to know the difference between good and evil. Now, you may have heard that word Shema before, maybe you haven't, but it gets posted around the church occasionally because it comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. It is the plaintive cry of ancient Israel living as a monotheistic society in a polytheistic world. See, I use those big words, so you would know that I'm educated and I have lots of information at hand. Loosely translated, the word means hear or listen. It goes like this: Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel. Yahweh, your God, is one, and you shall love Yahweh with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. If it sounds familiar, it's because you find it in the New Testament too. When Jesus is asked by the rich young ruler to name the greatest commandment, he replies, Shema, listen, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your soul, with all your might. Oh, and he says there's a second one that's similar. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Shema, hear, O Israel. You see, the Jews believed the heart was not the seat of emotion. It wasn't just what pumped the blood through your body. It was the center of your intellect, a place where you reason things out, where you learn the difference between good and evil. That's what the heart was. And so Solomon asks for a leb shema, a listening heart. Yahweh, he says, give me a listening heart, a heart that hears the voices of your people, a heart that hears your voice whispering in the dark of the night, a heart that yearns to know and to be known by you, a heart that is only for your word. We are living in days of unreasonable anger and uncertainty. That slide looks familiar. It's the third time I've used it in the last 3 sermons. We are neither listening for the voice of God, for the voice of people around us. No, we are rather screaming about our rights, our wants, our needs. Into that petulant rant comes the voice of a 14-year-old boy asking for the thing he needs the most. Yahweh, give me a heart that hears, a heart that listens, because God knows our tongues and our mouths are working just fine. Well, that's how the story begins, but how does it end? I mean, Solomon is remembered still to this day as the wisest of all the kings. Wise enough to start out knowing a leader he needs to tend to the needs and the hopes and the expectations of his people. And God granted him his request. He kept the promise he had made to his father David to establish Solomon firmly on the throne, at least for his lifetime. He gave him wealth and power and influence beyond measure. And the rest, as they say, is history, except perhaps once in a while, perhaps we should read that history. It's right there in the Bible. Just keep reading. 1 Kings goes into 2 Kings. It tells you the whole story. Solomon's story did not end so well. A reign that began with such promise, that was marked by inordinate wealth, where money flowed like water, inordinate influence. He married the daughters of every neighboring king and chieftain until he had 1,000 of them living under his roof. I don't know about you, but my wife has trouble putting up with one husband. Yeah, I know. I turned that around. Because this husband is a little wise, at least. And he was dealt with power. I mean, he was probably the most powerful ruler of his day in the world. But for wisdom, that was not so much. What began with a listening heart ended with a heart that was hardened. The Bible talks about that too, if you might recall. It ended in overreach and greed, the accumulation of wealth and power to the point where his heart no longer listened and his people hated him, and the kingdom that was left to him by his father David fell apart. So what should we take away from this story? Is it just a cautionary tale? Be careful. Appreciate the things you have. You might later lose them. I hope not, because truthfully, I don't need the Bible to tell me that. I do have enough experience to know that's the way things are in this world. No, I think, as I said, we're standing on the edge of something big. Maybe it's a collapse. Maybe it's the end of a story, or maybe it's the beginning of a new story. Solomon was just a child, an outsider, not the one expected to ascend to the throne. The kingdom, though, when he ascended, was tottering on the edge of rebellion. It had just gone through 2 failed coups. His enemies were all waiting for the chance to pull apart, to let the kingdom of David fall to pieces so they could all reclaim their freedom, their sense of identity and direction. They were all chomping at the bit, and this little boy, this 14-year-old boy, goes to his father's God's high place and asks for the one thing he could not acquire through learning or cunning or manipulation or politics or power. A leb shema, a heart that hears. And I like to think that this is a place where we can hear, where we can listen. I'd like to think the church has one thing going for it that Solomon didn't, because we don't have to go anywhere to find that God. We don't have to climb to some high place. We don't have to make an offering or a sacrifice. No. In this place, every time we gather, every time we celebrate the meal in this place, in the bread and the wine and the gathered assembly, our God comes down to us right here, right now, in real time. Today, in John chapter 6, Jesus speaks to the crowd that, like us, is overwhelmed by their world, by their lives. They came seeking to hear a word of hope and comfort, and at first they hear more bread talk. More bread talk. Chapter 6 is all about bread talk, and they say in their frustration, please, Jesus, no more metaphors. Just talk to us straight. So he says, all right, I'm telling you the truth. If you don't eat the flesh of the Son of Man, if you don't drink his blood, there's no life in you. But whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have life eternal. Now, for 3 weeks, we've been dwelling in the sixth chapter of John. We've heard about bread. Today, we encounter the heart of that chapter. And maybe we begin to see what's at stake, because Jesus is saying he's going to give his flesh for the sake of the world. He's going to stretch it out on a cross. His blood is going to flow freely from his hands and feet and side for the sake of the people he hears, for the sake that his heart is breaking over. For 3 weeks, we've read and studied and brought in the information, struggling to understand what Jesus meant by the bread of life and the food of heaven. Today, he makes this clear, abundantly clear, painfully clear. In the Word made flesh, he says, in the bread and the wine, God is given a visible form. God gives his all, his body and his blood, for the sake of his people. In the bread and the wine, we meet the God who comes down, a God who will be satisfied with nothing less than our all. Shema, hear, O Israel. He gives us his heart, his mind, his soul, his spirit, his feelings, his hopes and dreams and fears and concerns, all of it. In Jesus, all of God meets the whole of us so they can love, redeem, and sustain us in these difficult times in which we live. And my goodness, that is good news. Good news indeed. Because there's so much bad news out there, I need to hear this with my ears and speak it with my tongue now and then, just to be reminded of it. Luther used to use a phrase to talk about the sacrament of the table, a phrase that he borrowed from St. Augustine. He said, this is a visible word. This is the promise that God makes to you visibly given. In this visible word, you will see and touch and taste and feel the God who will be with you forever, who will stick with you forever, who will stand at your side forever, no matter what the times bring. So perhaps we should pray to God for a heart that hears that promise. And then pray that in hearing it, our hard hearts might be softened and changed. For as we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we hear in this visible word that God is offering us a promise so concrete, we can touch it with our hands. As we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we can hear in this visible word the promise that God has done it for us, for you. Here in this communion, we can meet the God who cares about our births and deaths, our marriages and jobs, our successes and failures, who has joined himself to us through the Word made flesh in this world. Here, can we hear his invitation to come and eat and drink? And can we hear his promise, this is my body, this is my blood given for you? Can we hear it? Because if we can, perhaps we can invite others to come too and hear it and be changed by it, to meet the God who comes where we are to help us live here in hope. We can invite others to be at this table because that's where the worthy and the unworthy come to meet God. Hear, Shema, O Israel. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. Here we pray, Lord, give us a heart that listens. To God be the glory. Amen.